Good afternoon. My name is Tim Roehl. I'm president of GAMI. George Broly, who is scheduled to do the presentation, is currently testifying live online with the House Committee on Oversight and Reform relative to the toxic considerations of lead poisoning America's children, a meeting called by Roehl out of the 17th District of California. This came in short notice. So I'm standing in for George. He may make it here later, but in the meantime, I'm the warm-up guy. Most of you probably have some familiarity with our long-term engagement in the certification of our G100UL fuel. What I have for you today is George's presentation and an update for where we stand in terms of getting that certification completed. This is the currently a 12-year effort on GAMI's part and still counting, even though we have completed all of the requirements of the STC. We have been waiting for only signatures on each of the two STCs, one engine and one airframe, that are complete, lacking only the signatures that includes the fleet-wide certification of the G100UL for all engines, all spark ignition piston engines on the type certificate data list, and all aircraft using those engines. It's literally thousands of models of engines and airplanes, with none accepted so far as we can tell. I think almost 100 pages long list of those engines and airframes is sitting in the Wichita Aircraft Certification Office, ready to be signed with the concurrence of the project engineer, the project manager, and the head of the Wichita Aircraft Certification Office, prepared to sign those as soon as they are released to sign them by headquarters in Washington, D.C. What you see here is a 10,000-gallon tank that we have on the airport in Ada, Oklahoma, where we are capable of mixing this fuel on site. We purchase the components, ship them in, blend them, send the fuel sample out for conformity testing by an outside laboratory. And then once the fuel has been conformed, we use it for FAA testing or our own testing in-house. We have to stop loving the problem and just fix it, said Michael Kraft back in 2010. We had been engaged in the unleaded fuel issues with GA for some time already by then. I participated on the Aviation Rulemaking Committee for unleaded avgas prior to the formation of PAFI and prior to our engagement under an STC to get our fuel certified. But it was in this time frame in 2010 when Continental was developing a new turbocharged engine for the Cirrus that was certified to run on 94 UL, though you may not have understood that it was only allowed to run on 94 UL under limiting power circumstances. So that was never finally certified in the SR-22 because they would have had to recertify the airplane for a whole slate of different performance parameters. Nonetheless, given Continental support of this unleaded 94 octane fuel and the support of others in the fuels industry mostly, who found this to be the only suitable replacement fuel because all it meant for them was that they had to remove the tetraethyl lead from the existing fuel that they were making. The result of that would be the 94 UL because they were hard pressed to make no capital investments in additional facilities, not willing to change any particular formulations, And they thought that was a common denominator solution that all of the current avgas producers at the time could make. Unfortunately, it was the least common denominator of the fuel that they could make, because not all of the avgas producers can start with the same quality of basic components. And so in order to get a consensus opinion, they had to start with something that everybody could make. That was the 94UL, which won't work in most of our naturally aspirated engines of 8.5 compression ratio or higher. And those are the engines that burn more than 70% of the avgas. And seeing as how there's only one tank on most FBOs for avgas, we need a one-tank solution. And the airplanes that buy most of the fuel are going to dominate that fairly obviously. So we've been loving the problem in 2010. We're still loving the problem in 2012 in spite of our best efforts. We decided at that time that we had the facility, we had an excellent engine test facility. We were building turbo normalizing kits that absolutely required 100 octane fuel. And for a self-serving purpose, we figured we'd probably just have to grab this dragon by the tail and see if we couldn't figure out a solution for a higher octane fuel. We knew that the fuel companies could build a better octane fuel than 94 if they cared to, and sort of under the build it and they will come scenario, we forged ahead. And by the way, George may show up if he gets through testifying in that committee. Okay, what we have here is a copy of a memo from the FAA that came to us in January following the completion of an intermediary further expansion of the models on our STCs at a time when Washington told Wichita stop any further issuance of expansion of GAMI's STCs. We want to audit this certification program, even though it's had tremendous scrutiny over the years by multiple aircraft certification offices. They said, we're going to call in an independent certification office. In this case, they called upon Atlanta. And they said, we want an independent review of the entire certification project. We said, hey, this thing's already had ample scrutiny. This is going to delay us further. You know, we're already delayed 12 years now for what maybe should have taken 5. They should never you mind, we're going to do this audit. So we waited while Wichita sent one of their most capable engineers to Wichita, who reviewed our entire certification file for 12 years, and believe me, that is a lofty task. And following his review of it, he came back with an absolute thumbs up, no squawks, concurrence, specific language. Based upon this review, our office finds the certificate project showings were comprehensive and credible, and the proposed amendment of the AML STC suitable for FAA approval. So we did the work. They stopped the signature. They said they wanted to audit it, and performed an audit, received a perfect score on the audit, still not good enough. Following that, the FAA decided they needed the Wichita Certification Office to write a thesis of sorts that told the story of the certification of our fuel. The intended purpose was supposedly to educate certain Congress critters or others in the FAA to explain how certification is done. We think mostly because the failed PAFI program was being reconstituted as Eagle, and they wanted to use our certification project to the benefit of our competition. Doesn't sound very fair. Nonetheless, they wrote this report, it was submitted, it was reviewed, still not good enough. So the FAA convened a tab, and I'll talk about that here in a minute, but this memo here dated March 3rd is from the Wichita Certification Office, from the project engineer, And as you can see here, it says GAMI has completed all of the showings and findings of compliance, and the AML is currently approved for operation, and this was for all engines, and it only awaits FAA approval to sign. And this was in March, following that further report and later the beginnings of the tab. And here is a similar letter from March 2nd from the Wichita Certification Office to us, again showing that we've completed all of the necessary showings and compliance and findings, and it only awaits approval to sign the STCs, and this is for the fleet-wide approvals that we've been seeking now for 12 years. So it was in the February timeframe that the FAA conceived of a new means for delaying our project with the development of this work instruction and the creation of a technical advisory board, which was gathered to cause further review of our certification program, with individuals on that board that were also engaged in the FAA's own PAFI program, which gave them access to some of our proprietary data, which we objected to. And they reshuffled the board and commenced with their review. And these people were more managers than engineers, none of them really fuel experts. And they spent the next 2 months with a promise of completion by the end of April and signed STCs no later than May 10th. And following the Technical Advisory Board's review, they came back with a number of recommendations and questions that frankly were just appalling, because for the most part the questions that they had were already answered in the certification paperwork, and one of the issues that was asked to be restudied, which was detonation, of course a key consideration, a subject matter which we have for 10 years said that the PAFI group has been doing wrong. We, however, have had a very successful history prior to the certification of the G100UL of performing multiple FAA certification projects wherein we perform detonation testing on, guess what, high compression ratio, turbo-normalized engines, and the result of those certifications have resulted in literally thousands of aircrafts modified under our STCs, flying for close to 20 years, compiling millions of hours of successful operation in the field without detonation considerations ever raising their head, as further proof that we knew what we were doing when we started doing the detonation testing, when we began the FAA fuel certification, and we proposed to use some of the same methodologies that were very state-of-the-art. And the advisory circular that was currently the guidance provided by the FAA was very outdated. The manager of the fuels office came to us and said, you know, your project's going to get a lot of scrutiny. We know you know how to do detonation testing, but nobody has ever documented how to do this in an issue paper. And an issue paper is the FAA's language for an engineering study that is detailed and signed off by the FAA, providing basically the highest level of technical clarity. So we said, you know, we really don't want to do an issue paper on this. We really know what we're doing here. And I see George is here, so we'll let him proceed here in a minute. So we said, that's going to take us a year. They said, no, we're going to do this on an expedited basis, I promise you. We proceeded to go through the entanglements of the issue paper. George essentially wrote a thesis on how to do detonation testing. It bounced back and forth a couple times between all the offices of the FAA, and in the end it was approved, and we were guaranteed that this issue paper being done, that we would never be challenged again on our detonation test methodologies. Guess what? The tab comes through, and the first recommendation was, we think we need to look at detonation again. Hello, George. Glad to have you. Jump on in. Come on. No. Come on. Thank you. Thank you. Right in your pocket.
You were doing good.
Well, I left something for you.
You left something for me.
So you've already got your page down there.
Yeah.
You can zoom this up.
Stay here and coach.
Okay.
Good afternoon. I think that was my, pardon?
I'm gonna take a seat.
Yeah. I think that was my third occasion to testify before the Congress of the United States of America. So, you know, this has just been, you know, who was the German guy, Kafkaesque experience with the FAA for the last 8 months. And, we've gone through I got asked this question before Congress a few minutes ago, how many different reviews have there been? And I said, well, during the first 11 years of this, we went through about one a year, including over 100 highly placed FAA engineers and managers. Even the director of the Engine Propeller Directorate spent 2 days in Ada going through this. 12 years ago, you know, on October 5th and 6th, 2010. But in the last 6 months, since last December, we've had 5 more reviews. An audit by an independent FAA branch office, the Atlanta office, audited the entire 12-year certification file, and it wasn't superficial. The guy calls me up one Saturday afternoon and says, I've been looking at some of these reports. I'm looking at one that's in German. Can you translate it for me? Got a volunteer already. Thank you, sir. The Wichita Aircraft Certification Office has more experience certifying aviation gasoline than all the other FAA offices in the country put together. They got assigned to this project by Earl Lawrence, then Air One, in the summer of 2020. And the statement he made to me when he called me up and told me that, he said, George, I've been looking at your file. This thing's taken at least 5 or 6 years too long. There's been way too much very high-level regulatory muckety-muck and not near enough practical engineering and test activity. I'm going to take all the people that are presently working on your project and ask them to go do nothing someplace else. Literally said that. And I'm going to put a whole new team in charge of your project. And by God, he put a bunch of good people in charge of it. I couldn't have asked for better scientists, engineers, human beings, interested in doing things the right way than what Air One put on the project in July of 2020. We got more done in the next 9 months than we'd gotten done in the previous 5 years. So here we are. I was asked this question by the chairman of the committee about 30 minutes ago. He said, in addition to all the reviews that he just asked me about, he said, what can we do to get fuel there? And I said, if they had signed the STCs back in March, when they were legally obligated to sign them, to pick up, the proverbial ballpoint pen and sign the pieces of paper that are printed out sitting on the manager's desk waiting for signatures, I'm pretty sure that we would have had rail car loads of finished, conforming, high-octane, unleaded G100UL avgas rail cars on the way to California within the next 60 days from today. We've had an unnecessary 6 or 7 month delay in trying to address the critical need for 100 low lead at some of the California airports. Infrastructure is difficult. It's very hard to get a reservation for a rail car right now. But you know, every day that goes by is another day that doesn't happen as we go forward. Okay, let me proceed here. On May the 3rd, this email was sent May the 4th. On the evening of May the 3rd, I had a long extended phone call with the then Air-700, a guy named Mel Johnson. He was new to the job, been there about 6 or 8 weeks. And we knew this tab report was coming up to be signed. It had already been drafted. And I asked him a series of questions on the phone call, and they had to do with who was going to resolve any of the recommendations, who was going to be authorized to make the disposition of the recommendations. A disposition is a code word inside the FAA. And he said, no, that's going to be the engineers at Wichita that are in charge of your project. And I said, are you sure? He says, oh yeah, I guarantee it 100%. Quote, end quote, I guarantee it 100%. Quote, end quote. So the next day I got to thinking about that, and I wrote him this email at 10 o'clock in the morning on May the 4th. And notice that paragraph B said that the ICT ACLB, that's FAA code words for the Wichita Aircraft Certification Office branch, would be free in their discretion to share the report with George Brawley and Tim Roehl, the applicant. And then importantly, most importantly, D and E highlighted that the final disposition of any recommendation from the advisory board will be resolved by the Wichita Aircraft Certification Office in their independent discretion and engineering judgment. Somebody has to be responsible for making a decision. Harry Truman had to make a decision in August of 1945. Somebody's always got to make a decision. Who's going to do it? Well, in this case, I guarantee it 100%. It's going to be the Wichita Aircraft Certification Office engineers. And paragraph E, that after the Wichita ACO disposed of each of the advisory board recommendations, then the Wichita ACO would be free to move forward with completion of the STCs without any further delay. Sent that email at 10 o'clock in the morning. 6 o'clock that night, I get this response from Mel Johnson. Yes, you have captured the sequence correctly. Now, is there any ambiguity about that? A week later, he says, no, you misunderstood me. I'm not joking. Since then, we've had 3 more reviews of the tab that have been done by people in an office called Air 600. You've never heard of them. It's called Policy and Innovation. They're not part of certification. They're policy and innovation. Everything they do is supposed to happen before a project gets started or at the beginning of a project. None of it's supposed to happen at the conclusion of a project. And yet here we are. That tab report that he promised me in paragraph B that Wichita would be free to send me, well, he ordered them not to share it with us. We've never seen it. To this day, we've never seen it. Can't make this stuff up, folks. So they send this off, and it came out on May the 6th. It's not a draft. It's not labeled a draft. The Wichita people have told us that. They just said, our hands are tied. We can't even send it to you. They told us not to out of headquarters in Washington. So a month goes by, and on June 7th, they finally, the people in Washington that frankly knew almost nothing about our project or even the technical aspects of the subject matter of it, and whatever they did know, frankly, a lot of that was erroneous and misunderstanding. I don't mean that in bad faith sense. I mean it, you know, they hadn't been working the project for 12 or 13 years. They hadn't been working it for 2 years. They'd been looking at it for less than 30 days. With no input from the applicant as to, well, pick up the phone and call the applicant and ask him this question and see what the answer is. None of that. So we've continued to go through that process. Nobody to this day will tell us, well, I'll strike that, until Monday. Monday morning at just before this show opened, nobody in the FAA would tell us who is going to make the final decision if there's a dispute over the recommendations from that technical advisory board report. And finally on Monday morning, the new Air 1, Ms. Roehl, said it would be done, and she pointed to herself and a couple of her management associates. That's the first indication we've ever had as to who was ultimately going to take the responsibility for making the disposition of those recommendations. That's not the way it ought to happen. Remember, how did the FAA get in trouble with the 737 MAX project? Well, one of the very senior engineers out of the Wichita, strike that, out of the Seattle Aircraft Certification Office that was involved heavily in the 737 MAX, when he first heard about this project and what was going on, he made the observation to another FAA engineer who passed it on to me. He said, you know, the problem the FAA got into with the 737 MAX is that management was not listening to their engineers. And it looks like the problem the FAA's got with this project is that management's not listening to their engineers. How many times do you have to learn that lesson? So, here we go. As I mentioned, less than a week later, Air 700 told me, GAMI, that we misunderstood his email and that the Air 600 policy and innovation people were going to make the decision. So I want to share something with you. What you're looking at here is an act of the Congress of the United States of America. It is the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act. And down at the bottom of it, in section 565, is some very special language. 565C, Charlie. You can find it on the internet. It's 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act. So down here in paragraph C, okay, this paragraph was put in to make sure that the FAA would continue to approve the use of supplemental type certificate and approved model list. You need to thank the good Senator Jim Inhofe for that, because some of the alphabet groups whose names you're familiar with took that language out of the bill. And I got a call from Inhofe's office and said, why did they take our language out of the bill? I said, I don't know, they're trying to kill the STC. They want to love this problem for another 10 or 20 years. And so Inhofe's office got this language put back in. This language says explicitly that the existing regulatory mechanisms by which an unleaded aviation gasoline can be approved for use in an engine or aircraft by the type or supplemental type certificate for individual aircraft and engine types, or by approved model list supplemental type certificate providing coverage for a broad range of applicable types of aircraft or engines identified in the application, shall continue to be fully available as a means of approving and bringing an unleaded aviation gasoline into general use in the United States. And here's the key language that applies to where we are right now. Such approvals shall be issued when the administrator finds that the aircraft or engine performs properly and meets the applicable regulations and minimum standards under normal certification processes. Well, that's those two emails we got last March from Wichita. And then what does it say? Such approvals shall be issued. Not only is the FAA in defiance of their own regulations, you know, those little trivial Administrative Procedure Act things, they're in contempt of Congress for the last 147 days, every day. Do I have permission yet to speak freely?
Speak freely.
So that mysterious tab report was sent to Washington to Air 600 to be rewritten. Air 600, as I mentioned, is known as the Policy and Innovation Group. And so where are we now? Well, you know, PAFI got started in 2012. We were asked to join the PAFI project. I had a couple of questions. I was talking to the guy in charge of it, the guy named Peter White, who was then designated Air 20, head of the fuels branch, the FAA fuels branch. And I said, well, Peter, if we get in this project, I said, we've been doing this for 3 years. We got a bunch of test plans and testing already done and approved. Are we going to get credit for that as part of the PAFI process? Well, no, you have to start over again. He timed that just right as an exclamation point. You got to start over again. I said, okay, I got another question. I said, if during the process of doing this testing we need to tweak the specification and adjust it slightly, are we going to be allowed to do that? No, it's one and done. One and done. Can you imagine trying to design an airliner where you submit a preliminary set of plans? And as you go along, you need to adjust the angle of the flaps by 1 degree, and they tell you you've got to start a new project. I mean, that's the kind of stupidity, not to mince words, that is involved in that kind of research and development project. So, I mean, that's not how science is done. You know, that's like asking Thomas Edison to find the right filament for the light bulb the first time he tried. Well, it took him 1,000 tries. That's not how real engineering or real science is done. Everybody knows that. That program was doomed to failure by its architecture all the way back when it was started in 2012. It cost $80 million direct appropriation, and no telling how much other fudgy budget stuff that out of the federal treasury. So rest in peace for that. So here we are now, a decade later. PAFI, well, it kind of failed. You know, somebody asked Air One at a press conference at one of these one of the initial Eagle meetings in early March. At the press conference, somebody said, "Wasn't PAFI project just a monumental failure?" And Air One's response was, "Oh no, it was a screaming success." Well, can you explain what you mean by a screaming success? Well, I love that. It gives this old man a chance to collect my thoughts. So he says, well, it was a screaming success because of all the lessons that we learned from that experience. All the lessons we learned from the failures. Screaming success. Quote, end quote, screaming success. I thought about that a minute and I said, yeah, about a week after July of 1863 at Gettysburg, what if somebody had asked Robert E. Lee, wasn't Gettysburg a screaming success? And he said, oh yeah, it was a screaming success because we learned this really great lesson. This really great lesson, don't make frontal assaults on well-defended high ground. Lord of mercy. So in place of PAFI, we have a new acronym. Eliminate aviation gasoline lead emissions by December 2030. Eagle. Will y'all allow me to have a little fun?
Yes, sir.
Can we stop and have a little fun? So think back, put your history hats on. December 8th, 1903. The Potomac River. Are we having fun yet? This gets more fun. So then, 9 days later, how many of you know where this is going? Raise your hand. There we go. December 17th, 1903. Maybe that's arrogantly presumptuous, but I do identify with that. Okay, but seriously, where are we now? As of Monday morning here at Oshkosh, last Thursday I got a request from our new Air 1, Miss Roehl. Every report I've had on this lady is that she is a very good structural engineer. She was the certification manager for several major certification projects at the Los Angeles Aircraft Certification Office. Among those, she did a lot of project management for Robinson Helicopter. I talked to their engineers. They said, yeah, she's pretty good. She's smart, she's well educated, good engineer. She's not afraid to make a decision. She's not afraid to make an engineering decision, but she knows her boundary limits and her limits, and when she needs to get somebody that knows something more than she does, she's not afraid to go do that. Perfect. It's exactly what we should all have for good FAA engineers. So she became Air 1 in place of Earl Lawrence about 60 days ago. So I got an email from her last Thursday saying she wanted to meet before the show opens this past Monday here at Oshkosh. And so we had that meeting starting about a half an hour before the show opened. She told us during that meeting that she was going to send a team from Air 600, the people that did the review of the review of the review of the review of the review, the tab review, to GAMI during the second week of August. That's 12, 14 days, 9 days from now, to, quote, resolve the recommendations from the tab report. She promised us that our responses to any of that would be dealt with within 14 days. I'm hopeful, but I've been burned. Tim and I have been burned so many times that, you know, we look like we came out of a third-degree burn ward from a napalm attack. You know, you got to keep in mind that according to that May 4th email that we saw 10 minutes ago from Air 700, each of those recommendations were supposed to have been resolved by the cognizant engineers in the Wichita way back in the month of May. We're now in the late July, getting ready to head into the month of August, and probably looking at the month of September. However, maybe I'm a perpetual optimist, and maybe I'll have to eat all these words, but I am somewhat optimistic that Ms. Roehl, the current Air-1, that she will be able to bring this regulatory nightmare to some kind of a timely conclusion, hopefully in the month of August. I want you to keep one thing in mind that's really important. If those STCs had been signed in the month of March, as the FAA was legally obligated to do under their regulations and under the act of Congress required them to sign those because all of the certification requirements had been fulfilled. If they had been signed then it's very likely that sometime in August, not later than September, there would have been railroad cars full of G100UL AF headed to California and distribution to airports at Reed, Hillview, San Martin, the flight school at Bakersfield, and to fuel tanks for Robinson Helicopter in Los Angeles, so that they don't have to shut down their piston helicopter production line if Los Angeles precipitously bans 100-low lead. More than likely, that would have happened. I am authorized to tell you that, everybody one of the big deals that this has come from the guy that runs the General Aviation Manufacturers Association. He's been saying this for 2 years. Well, it didn't make any difference if the FAA issues those STCs. Nobody will ever actually help make this fuel, because it hadn't gone through the highfalutin vaunted expertise of all the subject matter expertise types in the in the ASTM International. Well, I've been authorized to tell you that one of those little oil companies that nobody's ever heard of, whose name you would recognize driving down the street because it's got an unusual pair of X's in the name, that Exxon has advised us that they have a particularly suitable stream of one of the key major components for the fuel, and that they have had their pipe fitters union out there changing plumbing and whatnot, and that they're expecting to start providing us some early shipments of that particularly suitable component for use in making this fuel sometime in the middle of August this year, not next year. So, when people tell you that nobody's going to make this fuel, they don't have a clue what they're talking about. Why do they keep saying false things like that? There's got to be a motive, or there's got to be a reason. I don't understand why they keep saying those kinds of things. I did share that with the Congress of the United States about an hour ago. Now, this is a really touchy subject, but it's real. Further delay in signing the G100UL AF STCs creates other risks. During one of the opening testimony statements by one of the experts in this congressional hearing, they made the observation that the number of flights in and out of the Reed Hillview Airport since the banning of 100-low lead had actually gone up instead of down. So it didn't do any harm to ban the lead. Well, why have they gone up? Well, it's gone up because somebody comes and lands their airplane in the middle of the night at Reed Hillview and goes home and goes to bed, and before they get to make their next large trip, 2 days later they fly out 20, 30, 50 miles, get a load of 100-low lead, and fly back and park their airplane with full tanks. That creates traffic, and it actually puts more lead into the atmosphere around the airport than if they'd kept selling the lead at Reed Hillview. Unintended consequences. So banning the lead at these airports does create other risks. There's already been multiple threads, discussions on the various pilot discussion boards about, well, I've got a 100-octane airplane, but I think I could probably mix a little of this and a little of that with this 94UL stuff, and maybe I could fly this without it. I'm just sure I could do that. God forbid. But the FAA, somebody in the FAA needs to think about this seriously. What is the blowback going to be on the FAA for having stalled this project if, God forbid, there's a potential and it turns into an actual refueling or misfueling accident? due to the improper use of 94UL in a high compression engine at one of the California airports. One hell of a stink. There's going to be what is there going to be a whole lot of? Finger pointing in every direction possible. So has anything changed since Sun and Fun back in April? Maybe. It's kind of fun. The native color of G100UL has a yellowish tinge to it as blended. It is at least theoretically possible that it could be, by somebody, confused with a really poor quality jet fuel and cause a misfueling accident. So this is just almost serendipitous, poetic. Anybody take an art class in grade school? What do you get when you mix blue paint with yellow paint? So how do they make 100 low lead blue? They put a little blue dye in 100 low lead. How do you make G100UL green? You put a little blue dye in it. There you are. You put about the same dose of blue dye in it that you put in blue 100 low lead. Problem solved. Now, interestingly enough, we had already done this before they started the TAB project, but that actually ended up being one of the recommendations. One of the 6 recommendations of the TAB was, oh, this is completely unacceptable. It might be able to be confused with jet fuel. Tell us a problem we haven't already solved and addressed. Can you softly say the magic word? What's the magic word? Everybody, now together. Green. The world is all about green. Well, here's a little green. Love that picture. The only turbocharged high compression aircraft in the world that has routinely over the last 12 years flown on a high-octane unleaded avgas. This is one of my favorite pictures with one of my favorite people in the cockpit. John Deacon is flying that Bearcat. Picture was taken over the Channel Islands. Rest in peace, John. Questions? Anybody? Now's the time. Okay, I'm going to start with you, and you're next. Speak up, sir. I'm old and got hard of hearing, but still have a medical.
Has anyone considered having standing to go to an Article 3 court to sue the FAA? Who has standing to sue the FAA to follow their own guidelines in an Article 3 court?
That sounds like that question came from a lawyer.
Well, I've lived with enough of them. I've been through a lot of litigation with the government.
So an Article 3 court is a court that's got a sitting United States federal district judge in it.
Yep.
And it turns out how many lawyers are in here? Come on, fess up. Come on, there's got to be more than that. So most of the time, a lawsuit involving trying to force an administrative agency to do something involves a trip to one of the court in D.C. or the Court of Appeals in D.C., one of those places. But there is an ancient and honorable and well understood remedy that applies in a certain limited set of circumstances to compel a government officer to not exercise their judgment, but to hunting for my ballpoint pen that I hid, but to perform, oh, there it is, thank you, but to perform a ministerial act. And picking up a ballpoint pen and putting a signature has been defined as a ministerial act in federal law since, wait for it, 1803 in the somewhat celebrated case of Marbury versus Madison. And jurisdiction in every single federal district court in which either the applicant or the respondent, in that case either GAMI lives or the officer to whom the writ of mandamus is to run resides, has jurisdiction to entertain a writ of mandamus. The last time I looked at the draft of that lawsuit, it was only about 21 pages long. As lawsuits go, it's not very long. Next question, sir.
So I have a logistics question. After you get the STC, let's say I think it would just say Vega do this. Okay. So now you are the only guy with a zero-lead solution. So you become a monopoly and you own all GA fuel supply. Is that what you?
Step up here. I want you to ask that question to everybody. Here.
All right. So I'll do the favor for public.
Hi, this is Shyam Jha from Coco. I'm a board member. So after you're going to get this STC now or a little later, I know that. So what happens then? You become the only company in the world with an unleaded solution and have a monopoly. Is that what you're angling for, or are you going to share this with others?
I will answer your question. Is Craig Sincock here? The guy in a red shirt back there? Craig Sincock, founder, chief executive officer of a series of FBOs nobody's ever heard of called AvFuel. He's one of my heroes. He started that business driving a truck. I'm serious about that, Craig. He came to us and we entered into agreement, and one of the very first things he told me was, George, I do not want to be the king of AvGas. And so our written agreement with AvFuel is we're going to designate them to vet people to produce the fuel. And any refiner or blender that can meet the quality assurance requirements is going to be allowed to produce the fuel. That's our commitment to him. It's the right way to do this. And I really appreciate your question. Anybody disagree with that approach? I hear thunderous silence. Thank you. Yes.
Let me say something about the fungibility of the fuel.
Yeah, Tim points out that I need to mention something about the fungibility of the fuel. And by the way, if you run into somebody from AvFuel or Craig, thank them because they've been enormously helpful and supportive of our difficult activities over the last several years. If you go to YouTube or wherever it shows up on this congressional hearing, you'll hear somebody saying, well, just getting an STC doesn't do anything. You've got to have this industry consensus, and then you have to have all the OEMs because they're worried about their warranties, and then you've got to put all this infrastructure in to put fuel tanks in and all this kind of stuff. Complete horse hockey, nonsense. Every last part of it. This fuel is completely fungible with 100 low lead. It says so in the flight manual supplement. You can land your airplane at an airport with half tanks of 100 low lead, or 5 gallons left of 100 low lead, or 95 gallons left at a 100-gallon tank of 100 low lead, and you can top off with G100UL.
It's already approved.
And it's already approved by the FAA, signed off on. Now, let me give you some practical applications of that. Let's say you're an FBO and you've been selling 100 low lead out of your 10,000 gallon above ground storage tank. and your pilots or you or whatever want unleaded high-octane avgas. So you burn that last 8,000 gallon truckload of fuel down to say there's 1,500 gallons left of the tank so you don't run out. You pick up the phone and you call the nearest supplier of G100UL and say, hey, how fast can you get me a load of that fuel? Be there in 4 days. You got enough left? Yeah, I've got enough. So 4 days later, an 8,000 gallon transport shows up. It dumps that fuel in on top of the existing 100 low lead. Now that creates a real problem unless you've thought about it in advance, because normally, without some highly advanced forethought, what's left in that tank when you mix those two things together? There's a name for it. It's called hazmat. Now you've just created an environmental nightmare. How do you get rid of it? Well, we actually thought about that in 2011. And in our FAA approved specification, under the Table 1 properties, there's a note and it says G100UL that is intermingled with conforming G100UL that is intermingled with conforming 100 low lead remains a fuel that conforms to the G100UL specification. Therefore, it's not hazmat, it's G100UL by its own specification. So that's, you know, how much better can fungibility be? So there's all this talk about getting Congress to fund a whole new set of fuel tanks to go to all these airports. Nonsense, BS. Every single tank that exists at one of these airports, it's already an approved tank. You can drop this stuff in, it's a complete drop-in replacement for 100 low lead, and the transition from one to the other, or even back and forth, becomes completely seamless. Okay, that's 2 questions. Next question.
George, could you comment on the political side of this, similar to the pilot bill of rights that succeeded when regulatory failed?
Say that again.
With the pilot bill of rights, it only happened because of the political side of the government. The regulatory side wouldn't do it. So is there a political effort, like you were just in that, is there political work to press the issue to make the government succeed?
There is some considerable effort being undertaken. Frankly, it's a little late. I am of the opinion that unless some key members of Congress, including members involved in the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which controls the FAA budget, are willing to step up and simply tell the FAA that there will be no funding for Eagle until the FAA complies with its rules in its previous act of Congress and signs those STCs. It's pretty simple. If you want this other money that you're going, this other taxpayer money you're going to go waste loving the problem for another 10 years for a problem that somebody's already found and has an approved solution for, at the least you can do is tell the guy in Wichita, the manager, to pick up his pen and sign the paperwork. Next question. Let me get you in the blue shirt, and then you, and then you.
If you're able to get an STC through the FAA, will that stop Eagle? Will you become then the only provider of 100?
Well, it won't stop Eagle if Congress wants to spend $115 million of your dollars to fund a 10-year R&D program to find a solution to a problem that they've already signed off on and approved. I mean, yeah, that sounds like something Congress does every day. Did I answer your question, or if not, I mean, I was being...
I guess part of the question is, will there only be one winner in this?
Look, the market will take care of that, but just because we got to the finish line first is not a reason to move the goalpost. You know, how unethical can that be? Thank you. Now, who was next on the point? Okay, you were next, and then somebody else helped. Go ahead.
I think you mentioned that the tab had 6 findings, one of which was the color of the fuel. Can you comment on the other 5 findings?
So there was a total of 6 findings in the TAB report, or 6 recommendations, okay? One of them involved detonation testing. One of them involved the color of the fuel, so there were 4 more. Tim, you may have to help me, but one of them, for instance, was, well, we have concerns that about hot day, hot fuel testing. Well, did you go read the test reports? We did that in 2012 on September 5th. There were 4 senior FAA engineers in Ada, Oklahoma. It was 105 or 6 degrees on the ground. We took the fuel and put it in barrels, bought a Walmart hot water heater, cut the top off of it, put a copper coil in it, heated the water up, circulated the fuel through the hot water tank copper coil until we got the fuel to 110 degrees, preheated the wing tanks on the Cirrus, put the fuel in the wing tanks, measured the temperature, flew the airplane to 25,000 feet, shut the engine off, let it glide down to 16,000 feet with just turning the fuel from on to off, turned the fuel from off to on, and the engine restarted on its own. And then we landed, emptied the tanks, put 100 low lead in them, and repeated it. You can look at the data, you can't tell the difference in the data files. You can look at the videotape, and if you didn't know because there was a sticker on the panel which fuel you were running on, you couldn't tell the difference.
A test we shouldn't have done because the vapor pressures are the same as 100 low lead.
Yeah, we'd written a white paper, told the FAA why the test was meaningless because the vapor pressure on the 2 fuels is the same. They said, George, if you'll just run this test this one time, then nobody in the FAA will ever ask you to do that again. That's when the term tab had never even been invented. Well, we did it a second time. We did it with the airplane from Embry-Riddle because it was a carbureted engine instead of a fuel-injected engine. Got exactly the same result. So that was another item that's, they're asking questions about problems for which there's detailed responses. When they interviewed me 3 days before they signed the original TAB report that we've never yet seen, the manager of the 6-member TAB committee literally said during the Zoom call, when I started asking, I said, well, yeah, we explained all that in the report that we wrote. You know what his response was? We didn't have time to read any of that, it's too much of it. There's another person in this room that was on that Zoom call, I think, that can verify that. So one of them was that, the other one, what was?
Use of an independent fuel specification.
Oh yeah, well why don't you use ASTM for a fuel specification? Well, good God, do you want this to take another 10 years? I mean, ASTM is an old boys trading club. Think about kids standing around the ballpark trading, baseball cards. That's what ASTM is all about. We will never get anything done, but that's not the most important reason. The FAA asked us to go through ASTM in 2010. We made a good faith effort to do that. I personally went to an early ASTM meeting with our initial fuel spec in June of 2010. Presented a bunch of data. The FAA, everybody in ASTM, signs a commitment not to steal intellectual property. 30 days later, one of the major oil companies filed a patent using the information that I disclosed the month before. You don't find out about patent filings for months later, but we found out about it about 6 or 8 or 9 months later. Went back to the FAA and said, sorry, we ain't ever again going to do that. The first time it's your fault. Second time it'd be our fault. It's not ever going to be our fault again. Does that answer your question? So there was somebody else down here, I promised. Go ahead.
Did you think about certification outside of the U.S., particularly Europe?
Yes, and we're so close to the finish line here that would be an enormous distraction, although it has a lot of poetic justice associated with it.
Okay.
Yes?
The question, George?
Pardon?
The question, repeat the question.
His question was, why don't you go to EASA in Europe and go do it through EASA? Okay. Well, EASA, frankly, is more bureaucratic than the FAA.
Not in all respects.
All right, yes, sir. All right, wait a minute. He was probably first.
The STC, I imagine, is a flight manual supplement, some placards. What have you come up with a preliminary pricing structure for what the STC would cost?
Very good question. The STC, what does it consist of? Yes, an approved flight manual supplement that is universal for every airplane, every engine. A set of placards, standard placards that you go out there and put around the fuel filler port, and a standard set of instructions for continued airworthiness, ICAs, and the pricing structure on it is basically somewhat similar to those that are out there for some of the other STCs, where a flat rate per airframe and so many dollars per horsepower, or maybe so many dollars per category of horsepower. It's very simple. But that raises another issue that I want somebody remind me to come back to about how do I get the STC? Okay, but let me take his question, then I'll come back to the one I just made up. Yes, sir.
Can you name which airframe OEMs have been supportive of seeing this STC through, and which groups have been obstructionists?
Yeah, I can. So early on, after we had started all this material compatibility testing, that was one of the other items on the list.
I was ready for that.
We recognized, look, we had done a rig test. We had almost every weighted component that you could imagine in that fuel flow circuit for that rig test. That rig test was actually the idea of one very good FAA engineer. And God bless him, his name was Kevin Brain. And it took us a year to run it. Fuel sat in the tanks. We had a brand new out of the box 1954 fuel bladder from a T-34 that had never been out of the box. We had a 30-year-old bladder out of a salvage yard from a Baron, because there's used bladders out there. And then we had another one out of a completely different material. And then we had a Lycoming fuel pump, a Continental fuel pump, selector valves, check valves, fuel selectors out the wazoo, all strung up in series. The two OEM fuel pumps had electric heaters on them, driven by electric motors. They were cycled on. They'd run for 2 or 3 hours running hot, then they'd sit for 24 hours or 2 days, run them again for 3 days, shut them down for a week, run them again. That all took a year to do that.
Switch back and forth between 100 low lead.
Yeah, and we started out with 100 low lead for a day or two, and then we drained all that, put the G100 in there. We ran it for 9 months that way, and then at the end of that, we took the G100 out and put the 100 low lead back in and ran it just in case the 100 low lead caused it to shrink or expand or do something crazy.
Question related to what OEMs have helped.
So then the question was, which OEMs have helped? Thank you, Tim. And the answer is, when we were doing all that, I said, well, wait a minute, there's something we're missing that's really important. Because there's one of those OEMs out there, we don't have any of that stuff on this test rig. And that's an OEM that has epoxy composite fuel tanks. Does the word Cirrus come to mind? Some of them are epoxy composite with carbon fiber in the fuel tank. So I got a hold of Pat Waddick at Cirrus and described the problem to Pat. He said, George, send us some fuel. I will have the tests rerun using the same test plans we use for 100 low lead, but using your fuel. My engineers will run it, they'll write the reports, and they'll send you the results at Cirrus's expense. God bless Cirrus. You see Pat Waddick or somebody at Cirrus, go up and thank them. That was really important. By contrast, at one point, Continental wanted to test some of our fuel. We sent them several barrels. 3 years later, I called them up and said, I never have seen a test report. They said, well, we never have got around to it. I said, are the barrels still there? He said, yeah, they've never been opened. We'll send them back. Okay, so they did. That was wonderful, because we'd been wanting to do a long-term durability test. And those barrels have been sitting in this god-awful place called Mobile, Alabama. It gets hot. hot, it's humid, you know, all these bad things. They send them back, we open them up, we test them, we put them on the test stand, we run it. They're absolutely fine after 3 years sitting there. So that was serendipitous. We've invited Lycoming to come to ADA to learn to look at the entire certification file. They won't sign an NDA. They won't sign a non-disclosure agreement. We've offered to put every single certification document on a 12-foot long conference table and on the floor all around it. Let them read through it, and we would answer every question that they had. And they can't find the means, ability, or the time, or the resources to do that. So back along this high muckety-muck stuff that somebody said, well, we've got to have this industry consensus because we've got to have all these people, these companies that have got these warranties, we've got to have them to buy in on this. Well, frankly, that's the worst thing they could possibly do from a liability point of view. We don't need their blessing. What % of the engines out there flying are still under warranty by Lycoming or Continental? 1%, 2%, maybe 3% of the engine flying. We don't need their blessing. Be fine if they want to, but if they go talk to their lawyers are going to say, hell no, you're not going to do that. You know, that just gives us another line of defense if there's a product liability suit. I mean, you know, nobody's looking at the realities of the situation when they raise those kinds of objections. Okay, did I get back to you?
How do you get the STCs?
Pardon? How do you get the STCs? Yes, okay. So we have proposed to Air 600 Policy and Innovation, P&I, that they collaborate with us to create a 21st century technology for getting an STC for the airplane. So think about this. You're a very careful pilot. You're careful with your planning. You're in your airplane, and you're burning 100 low lead, and you're going from point A to point B, and the weather gets in the way, and you have to land at a different airport than what you've carefully planned for. And that airport no longer has 100 low lead. It only has G100UL. You have been dilatory in not buying the STC and putting it on your airplane. You're stuck, right? You go to the FBO says, hey, show me the placard. You know, well, I ain't got them. I can't sell you the fuel. That's a liability risk for the FBO. What do you do? Well, let's see, I get a hold of my mechanic and he mails the form to Oklahoma City. Yeah, right. So we came up with a written proposal to allow the following, that the pilot could pull out one of these, go to the appropriate GAMI website, purchase the STC, download a QR code to their phone, which contained all the relevant information, including the flight manual supplement, the ICAs. Couldn't send them the placards, but they could take that QR code, walk into the FBO and say, scan this, I'm legal. Put it in my tanks. He says, fine. You go out there, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, there's a FAA inspector out there. He's saying, wait a minute, you don't have placards. I just saw them put this fuel in your airplane. I need to see your certificates. You say, wait a minute, I'm legal. Well, how do I know you're legal? Scan the QR code. QR code authorizes you to fly for 30 or 60 days without the paperwork. The QR code is a functional substitute for the paperwork. What could be simpler? It's the 21st century, folks. Why not do that? Well, Air 600 hasn't bothered to even take a look at that question. They're supposed to be in charge of policy and innovation. Is that an innovation? Damn straight it is. All right. Question, somebody else. Did I satisfy your, do you agree? Did anybody here disagree with that approach? If you do disagree, stand up and snarl at me. All right, thank you. All right, question right there.
You mentioned doing the testing at a turbo normalized. Did you do any testing with like turbo boosted or any larger piston engines?
Very good question. So I want to tell you a story. we had this issue paper on detonation testing that Tim Roehl was describing to you as I drove up the borrowed golf cart. Loaned to me, by the way, by Kevin O'Halloran. Thank him. So we got ready to do the formal detonation testing. And the guy in Wichita said, George, I'm going to delegate this to you guys to do this. And I said, no, I won't accept that delegation even though I'm a DER. Well, why not? I said, I'll catch too much flack. I want the FAA in Ada, Oklahoma, in the test cell, sitting next to me when those tests are run. Okay, we got COVID. I said, get an exemption. They did. We had a 5-page line-by-line checklist of tests we're going to run. All kinds of different fuel. And mongrel fuels, combinations of 100 low lead, G100, minimum spec fuels, standard motor octane fuels of all those varieties, tests in every combination. On an 8.7 to 1 engine with a turbocharger that had an electronic controller on the wastegate so we could set the manifold pressure at any pressure we wanted. We ran, that was a Cirrus engine with our TN rated at 30 inches of manifold pressure. Most of those tests we ran at 35 inches. That's the equivalent of about 44 inches on a turbocharged low compression engine. It passed on all those. We get through this whole series of tests. We started it on Tuesday, and it's 3 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon. And we get through the list. The FAA guy looks at his list, says, George, I think we've finished. And I said, I think so. He said, well, you've got that little screen thing up there where you can make notes about each test. He said, I want you to change the note. I want you to put a new note in there. Okay. And the new note that he had us put in the screen was, the applicant has successfully, the applicant, based on the raw data, has successfully completed all of the test items in the matrix of test items for successful completion of the detonation testing. He said, put that in there and take a screen capture. So we did. He said, George, are we done? And I said, no. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, way back up there at the beginning of this list, there's this optional item. He looks at me, he knows exactly what I'm talking about. He says, George, are you sure? Do you really want to do that? I said, yeah. He said, I said, I want to try and destroy the engine by running it at the highest possible manifold pressure I can run it at and see if it'll work on this fuel. And I want to do it while the FAA is here. So I turned around to the little girl that's running the absolute, turbo wastegate controller. Her name's Lorelei. I said, Lorelei, give me 37 inches of manifold pressure. Now remember, this is an 8.7 to 1 engine. We got it running at red line everything. CHT, IAT, oil temperature, all of that, up there. So we rerun the test at 37 inches of manifold pressure. Go back, successful. Say, Lorelei, give me 39 inches. The FAA guy, Kevin Marks, looks at me and says, you got to be crazy. We're going to do it anyway. So we rerun the test at 37 and then 39. And I looked back at her and I said, Lorelei, give me 42 inches. So she's playing around with it. I keep looking at the gauge, and I've only got 41.4 inches. The engine is running at 135% of its rated power. It's running at BMEPs that are up there in the neighborhood of a Curtiss-Wright 3350 and an R2800. Only they're low compression engines. This is a high compression engine. She says, George, I can't get you 42. Look over here. She's pointing at the dial. The wastegate is fully closed. I can't get any more.
In the words of Scotty from Star Trek, I'm giving you all she's got.
Yeah, Scotty. Warp speed, Scotty. And we passed the test. There's a screen capture of that test that's in the formal FAA-approved detonation test report. Does that satisfy your curiosity? Thumbs up. Thank you, sir. Next question. Yes, sir.
So, given all this work, and God bless you for what you've done, seriously, I don't know how you endure this. I don't know. You know,
My son sent me an email the other day and said, "Father, you're the most stubborn human being I've ever known."
so given that, why I attended the Meet the Administrator meeting this morning, and Jack and he are, you know, they're kind of jumping up and down about Eagle. And, oh, it's only 8 years away. Why aren't they? What's up here? I mean, what's going on?
It's pretty inexplicable, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Well, and it's easy for me to be very, very critical of their public posture. What I can tell you is that Mark Baker and AOPA privately have been very, very supportive. When I think about it from their point of view, if they get too far out front on this publicly, then they're going to lose their access to information as to all this other stuff going on with Eagle, because they're going to get cut out of the old boys club. So I think they're trying to walk a tightrope, and so far they're doing it. Do I like it? No, I hate it. Is it helpful? No, it's extremely harmful. Do I think we'll get past it anyway? Yeah, I think so. Another question. Yes, sir?
What's your next project?
Take my wife on a trip. She's earned it. Seriously. Another question, technical question. Yes, sir?
You're fungible with 100 low light.
Yes.
Swift claims to be fungible with 100 low light with their 100R that they're proposing.
Yeah, but they're proposing theirs. This has already been done.
You expect to be cross-fungible.
Yeah, with 100R?
Yeah.
I have no idea. That's their problem.
Okay.
We're there first.
Sure.
Okay? No, that's not our problem. That's their problem. But very good question, by the way. Thank you. All right. Yes, sir?
So logistics from the refinery, they make a batch of the alkyl base stock. It goes on a rail car, not a pipeline, and then goes to distribution points where the aromatics are added, and then from there trucked out. Or is there any pipeline?
This stuff is too small of volumes to go in pipelines. You get too much leakage and wastage and crossover on the endpoints. So it's all going to be about rail, barge, or truck. All right, another technical question. Yes, sir?
You answered a question with regard, your answer included the words 100R. Would you please restate the question?
Yeah, the question was, so this fuel is out there, and then Swift, 2 years, 5 years, 9 years from now, whenever that is, they get their 100R approved. Is their fuel going to be fungible with our fuel? And my response is, that's their problem, not our problem.
Thank you.
Yes, sir, in the back with the glasses.
So you've got a Bearcat up there, which was originally certified for 115, 145 fuel, right? Assuming that there's an end date to your G100 completion, you think there will never be 115, 145 that can allow those engines to run at their original power?
So did you miss the part a minute ago when I was talking to this gentleman and I said this engine was running at BMEPs that were the same as a Curtiss-Wright 3350 and an ARC 2800?
No, I didn't miss it.
Okay.
But my question is...
All right, so here's the answer. So here's the real answer to your question. There's 2 octane ratings that go with our fuel, 100/130. We used to have something called purple gas.
100 low lead.
Yeah, for 100 low lead. We used to have something called purple gas. It was 115/145. The 145 is the so-called supercharged rating that's done with the ASTM D909 engine, Waukesha D909 engine. The motor octane number is done with a different engine, the F1, F2 engine. Very different test methods in the laboratory. But that upper number is what we call the rich rating for when the engine's running at full power, full rich. The MON number is the lean rating, if you will, for when the engine's running at its intended area of operation that would include less than full rich mixtures. So the supercharge rating on the tests that we have received from the laboratory on G100UL says, well, it's 101 MON. We ran the supercharge test, the D909 test, and we can't tell you what that number is because it's so high, it's off scale. It's somewhere above 160. So, can you answer your own question? Sure, they can be. Is it smart, given the limited availability of parts and durability issues with those engines? It's probably not the world's greatest idea, but inevitably somebody's going to want to do it.
I want to do it.
Yes, sir.
Given that information, is GAMI, TAT, or anybody else poised to take advantage of that in our areas?
I'm sorry, I did not understand your question.
Given that it's going to with this increased detonation margin, do GAMI, TAT, or anybody else have plans to take advantage of that and increase that power? Crank the rated power up.
Oh, I haven't heard any noise to that effect. I have been talking to some of the Warbird guys, and it is at least within the realm of not being stupid to be able to go do that. Is it done for nothing else other than exhibition and showing and bragging rights at the dinner table or at the bar? Everybody gets to be their own judgment. But look, the supercharge rating is there. Okay. All right, I'm going to take one more question and we're going to be done. You, sir, in the hat and the black shirt with the orange trim.
Will the STC be serial number specific on the engine with the airframe, or can you just swap changes, like the Jacobs on 195?
So if you've got a DC-6, you're going to get an STC for each of 4 engines by serial number, and another one for the serial number of the airframe. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
All right.
It's a requirement of the FAA.
Yeah, that's the FAA's requirement. It's not ours. All right. Gentlemen, and ladies, thank you very, very much for your attention.